going on? Just
It's an hour.
okay.
So, yeah.
My dog's chewing in the background is not too loud.
No.
Okay.
All right. So, hello and welcome to episode 39 of Table Talk, a series of conversations with scholars and activists who take an interest in the question of the animal and human animal studies. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. My name is Anu Pande, and the co-founder of the Indian Animal Studies Collective and co-host for this meeting, Susan Haris, is also there. We are really thrilled to have with us today Liza Bauer from the Justus Liebig University Giessen to discuss with us her new book titled Livestock and Literature, Reimagining Postanimal Companion Species. So a very hearty welcome to you, Liza. Thank you so much for making the time, and we are really looking forward to asking you a few questions about your absolutely wonderful work. I thought we could start with the term post animal that you use in the title of your book. And I wanted to ask you, in what sense do you use this term?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you first of all for inviting me. I'm really enlightened to be here. Delighted to be here. I mean, not enlightened. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to get the chance to talk about your work for an hour, and also to see that people are interested. And I am also thrilled that you're asking about the post animal, because this is not necessarily the first question I always get, because it actually digs into a very like into one of the core arguments of the book. So that also makes it a little tricky to answer. So I'll try to keep it as short and accessible as possible. But if in case anyone's interested to get like a really concise overview of what I mean by the post animal, besides my book, I published a short article on post-animal narration in the Substance Journal. And if you're interested after what I'm telling you now, you can look into that for a more concise version than the one that you find in the book. Because I use the term post-animal on two levels. First of all, I use it as a very direct analytical tool and as a signifier to describe species in the books that I read. And on the second level, I use it as a more self-reflexive and perhaps even philosophical figure of thought. And to come to the first level, as I said, it first of all simply helps me to describe and signify the characters that appear in the text I analyze. And it helps me to unlock their literary analysis. Because in the text I look at, the animal characters are often altered by some sort of technology, and these technologies can either be of obviously technical nature, as in the mechanical suits in Grant Morrison's We3 is a very famous example, or they can also be more hidden and of biotechnological nature, as in the AI microchips that are implanted into animal heads in Adam Roberts' bat, for example, or in the human DNA that is entered into the brains of pigs in Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. So the idea came when I was reading Adam Roberts' book, Bat, because this reveals to its readers in the very end that it's told from the perspective of a biotechnologically altered female fox. And then I noticed when I tried to describe the narrative voice that the category of non-human narrator does not really capture what is at stake in this particular narrative voice. And neither did the terms post non-human or human technology, or you could also say human technology, animal hybrid, like all these complicated terms didn't really capture what it was at stake, because the forms of beings that are described in the book no longer fit into these categories at all. They've evolved into something new. And so my motivation to unveil the idea of a static divide between humans and animals as a cultural construct led me to the idea to describe these characters as post-animals without a hyphen. And by this, I hope to suggest a radical but still somewhat playful removal of the human from the center of describing a species. And I'm, of course, not the first one to come up with the term. Cheryl Wind and Melissa Bianchi and also others have written about post-animal characters, and particularly an idea that Melissa Bianchi introduced. She mentioned a post-animal condition in a graphic novel. And this post-animal condition is a space where distinguishing who is or who is not human or animal is irrelevant. And I really like this idea of this irrelevance of where to draw the line. And this also leads me to the second reflective philosophical level of how I use the term post-animal. Like I mentioned, first level is the analytical level, second level, the reflective philosophical level. Because I argue in the book that sci-fi animal narratives can work towards deindustrializing readers' imaginations. And this is why I found post-animal figures so productive to think with, because I encountered moments in science fiction texts where readers are when they're really deeply immersed in a novel and they are in a particularly perceptive and open state of mind, they might experience a moment where they forget to ask whether they are just reading about a human or a non-human character. And they actually enter a state where it has become irrelevant to ask, is that a human body, a human mind, or is that an animal body, is that an animal mind? Yeah, so and I think that these moments where we forget to ask where to draw the line, that these can leave marks in our imagination, and these can really impact the next real world encounter we can have with a living non-human animal. So this is on this philosophical level, it follows kind of an indistinctionist stance on animal philosophy. And I could go on and on about that, but I might leave it at this. Just to stress once more, what I mean by post-animal is that post-animal figures invite readers to a playful removal of human-animal differences. And I mean this in a sense of Haraway's work and play or retraining. So post-animal figures are kind of a training ground for our imagination, a training ground where we can temporarily detach from the idea of an anthropological difference and practice what a world could be if human and animal were not so different at all. And this is very important also if we talk about farmed animals, because if you think more deeply about what farmed animals are, then you could already call them post-animal beings in the real world because they already have been altered by human technology in the sense of animal breeding, molecular techniques, or also more advanced biotechnological practices or xenotransplantation. So there are already post-animal beings in our real world, and science fiction puts that up on display.
Thank you. This is very helpful. And I imagine that in our subsequent questions, we will be coming back repeatedly to the question of the post animal, because it seems to me to be the very hinge on which your argument in your book is located. I'm glad that you also mentioned farmed animals as post animal in that sense here, because that leads me to my next question, which was you consciously and you basically write about why and how you prefer to use the term farmed animals as opposed to livestock. And I was wondering what this shift in nomenclature from livestock to farmed animals facilitates for you in building up your argument, in looking at farmed animals in literary texts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. Probably the most straightforward answer would be that calling them farmed animals might facilitate a sense of responsibility and empathy for these beings in question, whereas calling them livestock may actually block our ability to empathize with them or to care for them. So this is the basic idea, and to expand on this a bit more, I'd first of all like to say that both the terms farmed animals or livestock, both of these are human-made animal categories, and both of them can be seen problematically in view of animal ethics, of course, because no matter whether we speak of farmed animals or farm animals or livestock or pets or lab animals, we just put a single stamp onto a vast amount of distinct species and individuals. However, some categories are worse than others. So I'd say that the livestock category is particularly detrimental to our perception of animal beings, because we want to see cows or pigs as beings with perspectives, personalities, need, or even rights. And if we speak about them as livestock, we literally talk about them as stock that is alive or living stock. So the idea that pigs or cows are mere products that move around in intensive farming surroundings is very much present in this category. And I mean, sadly, it perhaps describes the living conditions of most of today's pigs and cows most accurately. But the thing is that I'm a cultural and literary studies scholar, so I firmly believe that the way we speak about animals and the language we use shapes the way that we perceive and treat them. So that means that if we speak of a cow as livestock, our brain directly frames the cow through a cultural filter that is shaped by the cow's use value. And very illustratively in German, we say Nutztiere. So Nutztiere literally means animals for use. And there's a very widespread argument that is that it were okay to cause harm to these animals because they are only livestock. And this comes very easy and naturally, as it is ingrained into our language use, and our language is an integral part of our culture. So therefore, speaking of farmed animals instead, does not directly focus on their use value, but in fact actually highlights the condition that we're speaking of a group of animals that have been altered by human farming practices. And this leads me back to the post-animal question earlier, because with this focus, a sense of responsibilities for these animals is implied. And I consider this very important because in farmed animal breeding, humans bring beings into existence that are in many ways dependent on humans. Take laying hens, for example, who have been farmed to have these ultra-fast metabolisms to produce at least an egg a day, and it causes severe damages to their health. Or also the pink-skinned and almost hairless pigs that get sunburned when they're exposed to the sun, as in contrast to wild boars who are perfectly adapted to these surroundings. Yeah, so therefore my motivation to call them farmed animals, just to really stress this aspect and to facilitate senses of responsibility and care for these beings instead of perpetuating the tendency that we put a stamp of living products onto these beings.
Thank you. This is really interesting because I have been thinking on similar lines about street dogs in the Indian context and how, again, nomenclature matters because the vilification of street dogs as menace and whatever usually happens in context of, the word stray being used. So stray dog instead of calling them street dogs, which is then, of course, negatively loaded. And I find that also attitudes are shaped by the words that are used, by the names that are used mostly. So this helps me also in thinking along these lines. Susan has her hand up. Susan, go ahead. And I would like to take this moment also to tell all our other attendees that we will be talking to Liza for an hour. And you are welcome to pitch in at any point of time with a question of your own. Just raise your hand or unmute yourself, whatever suits you better. Type the question in the chat box or pose it yourself. You're always welcome. Go ahead, Susan.
Hey Lisa, I was just thinking about science fiction, short stories or novels, especially, Margaret Atwood, in which she does have these post animals, as you call them. But it seemed to me while reading Atwood, especially that she's driving home the dystopian character of that particular society. And in that connection, those animal figures, those post animals, they seem to be more allegorical and symbolic uh, than animals that may appear in just other novels, perhaps a more realistic novel. So would you agree with me that in science fiction, in the post animals tend to be more allegorical to make a point about the society?
Maybe it's an interesting thought. So thanks for this, first of all. I mean, in Margaret Atwood's novel, there are so many different post-animal beings, and I think that some of them are more allegorical than others. I mean, the question is what you mean by allegorical. You mean that these figures are kind of staged by the author in order to trigger readers to reflect on something from their reality. That's what you mean, right? Yeah, because I think in these terms I'd agree with you, because what science and speculative fiction does very effectively is to pick up on real world aspects and extrapolate on them, exaggerate them a little bit, and then have post-animal beings that showcase to readers, hey, this is xenotransplantation gone berserk. You know, like in Margaret Atwood, in case anyone doesn't know the novel, there are these huge pigoons, and they have been bred to grow replacement organs within their bodies for humans, and this is a practice that is already being done more or less successfully. I mean, actually, when I submitted my thesis, there was news flash about this first heart transplant from a genetically modified pig into a human patient. I mean, then afterwards, both of them died. But still, these things are happening, and then science fiction very often picks up on that. So maybe in this regard, I'd agree that these texts point more self-reflectively onto the present. I wouldn't necessarily speak of that as allegorical, because as I understand the allegory or animal allegory is that we use human figures in fiction in order to convey human meanings only. So that let me think about what is an example for a good animal allegory. Like, you know, the graphic novel Mouse, which is where mice are allegories for the Jews in Nazi Germany. So this is what I would understand, and this is a narrative that I would associate with an allegorical depiction of animals, because these mice have little to do with mice anymore, but they're actually just stand-ins for humans. And in science fiction texts, I wouldn't say, I mean, there are obviously some science fiction texts that do that, but the ones that I'm interested in point critically to the real world, but still portray animal realities. So the pigoons and also the chicky knobs in Margaret Atwood's novel, they might allude to the real world, but they're still really connected to the animals. So they're not pure allegories. They are material semiotic metaphors maybe, but they still convey a lot of knowledge that is relevant for animal ethics. I hope this answers the question in a very long way.
Okay, then going on further, I found it intriguing how you refer to what Helen Tiffin calls the Cartesian dystopia for farmed animals and their lives, and how this has been really persistent. It hasn't gone away at all or abated. Um, on the other hand, you also draw attention to the fact that farmed animals have also largely been overlooked by animal studies scholars, as well as people writing literature, people making movies. So that we find that increasingly there has been a shift from, let's say, charismatic species and companion species onto other kinds of animal life, but farmed animals have largely been overlooked. And I was wondering, what in your opinion are the reasons for this, in the sense that the dystopia is visible, it's there, it does not fade away, but it does not find a resonance in literary and other forms of cultural representation or in scholarly work. And in that sense also, your book is a big breakthrough because you address this significant gap that exists. Why do you think this gap exists?
Yeah, thank you so much also for putting these ideas of the Cartesian dystopia and the overlooking of animals together. I think this is this already implies what I would have to say, that these two phenomena are emblematic of the situation farmed animals find themselves in, because farmed animals are being overlooked on all spheres of consumer culture. And literary production, as well as literary criticism, is also part of consumer culture. So farmed animals are being hidden by very complex mechanisms. So it's, again, a question that is tricky to focus on, but I'll try my best. So when Helen Tiffin talks about the Cartesian dystopia, she means that whereas most people no longer think of animals as unfeeling machines, because that is what Descartes said in the Enlightenment period, pigs, cow, and chickens continue to be treated as if they were. And the reasons are obviously manifold for this. I mean, you're all probably familiar with Dinesh Verdival's 3 levels of violence, so the intersubjective, structural, and epistemic. And the epistemic level of violence is the level that I'm mostly engaging in my book. Particularly if you connect this to the animal industry and farmed animals, I reflect in chapter 6 how science fiction animal text may actually challenge these complex mechanisms that are behind that. Giorgio Agamben's anthropological machine, you might have heard of, it describes a complex cultural technical apparatus. And this apparatus has many, many gears, many cultural gears. And these gears function very strategically towards constructing who or what is considered human or animal or edible or inedible or indispensable or disposable and so forth. Like dogs are indispensable family members, whereas pigs are disposable products. Yeah. And so I would argue that the animal industry both leans upon and also feeds this sociocultural apparatus, because the fact that that meat culture marks cows, pigs, and chickens as inhuman, but additionally also as livestock, it kind of legitimizes the bad conditions under which they live and die. So, and in addition, the ideology of carnism propagates that meat eating is natural, normal, and necessary. Speciesist assumption ensure that farmed animals exist only to produce meat, whereas other animals are more valuable. So these are all different gears of that sociocultural apparatus, and these are all mechanisms that feed into this phenomenon that there's this Cartesian dystopia for farmed animals. And all these mechanisms shape a belief system that supports that we think livestock are fundamentally different from not only humans, but also from all other animals. So they're framed much rather as objects than as subjects. And this makes it very easy for consumers to detach emotionally from them. So whereas they care about charismatic species, they detach emotionally from the fact that cows can also be charismatic, but they are just livestock. And there's this very, very elaborate scheme that perpetually works towards keeping itself legitimate. And I think this is also very complex dynamics that probably sociologists could dig more deeply into. I mean, I can only look at the cultural, superficial level, but I think there's also socio-cultural mechanisms that feed into that as well. And of course, political reasons, lobbyist reasons. I mean, this is only, so what I'm saying here is only part of the problem, of course. So, but I think that already answers like part of the Cartesian dystopian question. And this is tied to the overlooking of animals, because I thought about this ever since I started working on the project, and that was in 2018. And a lot has changed since then. I mean, when I started working on this, I really noticed, okay, there's little done on this subject. Now there's much, much more out there. And I do think, I mean, I do not think that early animal studies scholars care less about farmed animals than they care about charismatic species. I don't really think this is the case. But I could imagine that it's a combination of two factors. And the first one is simply the lack of material. Because songbirds or squirrels, deer, horses, cats, dogs, whales, tigers are much, much, much more frequent in poetry or in narrative or in film than farmed animals are. So there's simply much more. So it's more straightforward to start there. I mean, animal studies like a new field. It's already been outrageous that you actually read literature for animals. So it's even harder to start with cows, because it's much easier to start with foxes, for example. And I elaborate on that in chapter 2.4 of my book. I call this chapter Narrating and Studying Narratives about Herds, Commodities, and Meat. And this describes part of what I think is the reason for this, because cows, pigs, and sheep and chicken are very difficult narrative characters to portray. So they are not only less famous or less liked, but they are actually difficult to portray, because narrative is a medium model to portray human stories. And human storytelling traditions have evolved to tell stories about clearly defined protagonists or antagonists. And these characters reflect and tell the readers what they do, why they do that, and the goals they pursue drive the plot of a story. So this is the basic model of a narrative. So there is already an obstacle if you want to present non-language using characters. And if authors and poets want to do that, nonetheless, they can easily humanize animal characters like cats and dogs to convince readers and publishers that this is a story worth reading, because people are already used to humanizing dogs or to humanize a butterfly or a songbird because they encounter them every day. But if you write a story about chickens, whom readers and publishers are constantly being told that they are non-individuals, these are just much more unlikely narrative characters or lyrical eyes. With sheep, it's even more drastic. Like an individual sheep is described by an uncountable noun. So this is a linguistic mechanism that a flock of sheep is linguistically the same as an individual sheep. So that shows you how it can actually be tricky to put a story about an individual sheep into narrative words. So while talking or writing or thinking about sheep that are pursuing individual goals might be much more difficult to convince readers of than if you write a story about a horse like Black Beauty, which was one of the first animal autobiographies. So, and then there's also, of course, there's also the reason that if a reader consumes animal products daily and they are already very skilled at emotionally detaching from animal suffering, they may even be reminded of inconvenient truths if they read a story with a dairy cow protagonist, and this book would probably not sell well. And so this is then the second factor. It's tied to economics. It's maybe a bit of a boring reason, but I think it's a huge factor, because which books are being published and read and which are not, and the same holds true for films, is really much tied to economical questions. So the mere fact that it has surely been difficult to convince publishers to publish a story about an animal, or to publish academic scholarship in animal studies before the field was established, this is already difficult. And if you then publish a book about farmed animals, it's much more difficult. So I could even imagine that early animal study scholars were doing work on that but couldn't find a publisher, because I think it should actually be obvious that the animals that are most severely afflicted by imbalances in human-animal relationships, that these would come to animal study scholars' minds. So it cannot be a coincidence that there's this absence.
Lisa, I noticed in your text that you do address that even though these texts talk about animals in these unique ways, you also seem to suggest that literature tends to be very anthropocentric, even in its depiction of animals. And I think you meant to say that science fiction too, in that sense, it tries its best, but is also hopelessly anthropocentric. So my question is, when I have talked to animal activists, for example, and I've asked them, what's a novel that you've read that made an impression on you, they don't seem to care much about literature or be inspired by stories. They seem to believe in more direct action. So then, what do you think are some advantages that literature would have that perhaps direct animal activism would not?
Thank you. That really is an excellent question. I mean, there's two parts of the question. First of all, the anthropocentric bias of texts that kind of limits them, but at the same time, perhaps creates an interesting chance for these texts. And I guess the anthropocentric bias of literature is most easily explained by the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, it heavily relies on human language. So especially as it's presented in written formats. So no matter how hard authors try to portray non-human characters, they will always add a human filter. And you can compare that to a dog, for example, who perceives the world and us humans through his nose and smell. So whenever the dog perceives us, the dog attaches what we could term a canine bias to his perception of us. And if the dog's perception cannot ever fully grasp our human perception of the world, so our primarily visual perception of the dog can equally not fully grasp the dog's perception of the world. And if we take this further, so we have a perception of us or of a dog, and then we put this into writing, we add yet another filter. So there's a very thick human filter. We always have a human filter whenever we look at an animal. And if we then put this into writing, it's even thicker. And I guess what you imply with animal activists, they might not be that interested in literature because literature is also fictional, right? So so there's yet another level, another filter, the filter of fiction. So you detach more and more and more from the realities of actual animal experience. And this is perhaps why they wouldn't draw too much inspiration from that. But I think it might actually benefit animal activism a lot if they look a bit more into literature, because I mean, as much as I'm a fan and supporter of animal activism, it is a fact that it has not been as effectful as it could be thus far in most parts of the world, which is of course due to many, many reasons. But one of the reasons is the way they communicate. And the problem with animal activism is that whenever you tell humans directly what to do or what not to do, or what is what is not okay, or you apply to their bad conscience, or you tell them this is how you should eat, or this is how you should not eat. You shouldn't eat animal products, or you shouldn't kill flies, or whatever. So these more strategic ways of communicating animal ethical issues, they tend to put humans into positions that they feel accused of, and this often has the effect that humans look away from the issue. So an animal activist video will likely not reach a convinced meat eater, because a convinced meat eater will not want to be pushed into that reality. However, a convinced meat eater might read a novel or might watch a science fiction movie that is very popular. And if in this science fiction movie there's this more subtle self-reflective critique of the realities, they are not directly addressed as this is what you do and this is not right, but they see something and are invited to take their own reflection. So they, for example, look at an exploitative system, and then they might start reflecting, actually, this is very similar to what is happening in the real world, and they are invited to voluntarily question what they do, and they're not told to do so. And this is what I think is a major advantage that literature has, as opposed to non-fictional texts.
In that connection, I found it very interesting that I think you quote somebody else. You say that science fiction can be used to unsettle convictions, complacent convictions in this laboratory of the mind. I feel like that metaphor made an impression on you. So could you tell us a bit more about how that works? Is it I suppose what you mean to say is something about how the concept works in relation with the narrative itself, but I'd love to hear more.
So you mean the question of the laboratory of the mind?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, this idea refers back to Catherine Elgin's work on, and it also addresses a major body of criticism that is engaged with the epistemic functions of literature. So which kinds of effects can literary text have on the world? And cultural theorists argue that literature offers a platform for imaginative playing through different scenarios to envision the world in a different way than it actually is. And instead of simply looking at current dynamics that are harmful and cause problems, and looking at these from a problematic perspective, and thinking about clear outcomes of what is happening today. I mean, look at environmental degradation, for example, or climate change. If we see these real world narratives that are only constantly telling us how bad everything is, and we hardly see a way out. So it becomes very difficult to actually imagine different futures. And because we just see the reality, and the numbers, they just speak a very clear message. And this does not and this is very challenging for societies when they want to transform, because our imaginations are very limited by that. So what literature does, and what Elgin means by the laboratory of the mind, is that we undergo thought experiments. So literature is invites you to undergo philosophical thought experiments, and these can have an impact on your imagination and stretch what you consider conceivable. And in connection to farmed animals, I use that also to strengthen my call for deindustrializing our imagination. So I make the argument that we actually in lack of imagination when it comes to our relationships to cows or pigs, because we wonder, even if we stopped using pigs for meat, or even if we stopped drinking milk, so where would cows or pigs fit into society? What would be their ecological niche? So we don't really know an alternative. And this is something that animal activists probably also face. If you want to abolish animal use altogether, then would all animals go extinct? So, and I think it's a problem if you don't see any alternatives. It's a problem actually to transform. And this is what literature offers. It detaches you from the bounds of reality. So, and detached from the bounds, from the factual bounds of reality, you can experiment more freely. You can, for example, envision post-animal characters, as I mentioned earlier, right? So you have, you can temporarily play through, okay, what would it be if there was no difference between humans and animals? What would it be if humans and animals could speak? Or what would it be like if we could fly, or no matter, or what would it be if we had this new sort of technology that would allow us to solve this and that problem? So this is really the idea behind the laboratory, that we experiment with possibilities to expand on what we consider possible. And then this is all strictly fictional, right? So this is still not the direct connection to reality. It will not save the world in itself. But what it can do is it can work towards the shifts in our cultural imaginaries. And I think shifting and changing these cultural imaginaries, this is where literature really really digs into the roots of the problems. And if we don't change our imaginations and our perception of the planet and of other animals, then we might never be able to change. We can always be told what to do. We can be told not to fly so often. We can be told not to consume so many animal products. But if our identities, our cultural systems, if we don't incorporate that deep awareness of why we want to stop eating animals, or why we want to stop flying so much, then there will unlikely be any positive change. That was again a bit long, and I hope the chewing of my dog is not too loud, because he just entered the room. So let me know if it does, because then I'll send him out.
No, your dog is absolutely welcome to stay here. We
Okay.
like having this as a multi-species kind of audience, everybody's there. It feels more like the real world in that sense.
Sure.
I'm glad that your dog is there and chewing, because it brings me to my next question, which is also connected to what you were just telling us about, namely the process of deindustrializing the imagination. And I was trying to think of it in lines with the question of non-human animal agency. And I think in your writing, you also connected to the fact that non-human animal agency, be it in the form of the resistance of animals or a more, sort of recalcitrance, as you call it, is usually overlooked. But if we have a deindustrializing of the imagination, then these forms of agency would need to be acknowledged. Am I understanding it correctly? Is it they would need to be acknowledged, or does deindustrializing the imagination only happen when they are acknowledged, when they are rendered visible, when they are accepted as being there?
Thank you. That's an interesting one. The argument that I make in the book is that particularly that characters in like Margaret Atwood's Pigoons, for example, that actively engage in resistance, that these are particularly effective in causing disruptions to our reading expectations. So because once we have characters that actually do something and change the plot, then they are obviously much more prominent in the text, and perhaps these texts will be more directly effective in terms of challenging our imaginations. There is, for example, there are different animal characters in Margaret Atwood. There are the chicky knobs, for example, which are genetically modified chickens with massive breasts and multiple drumsticks. And these allude to biotechnological practices in a critical way and call for, and question the way this is being done, but they do not actively engage in resistance. So they do not influence the story in the same way that the Pigoons do, because the Pigoons become active. And so this is the first layer. Well, oh, hello. Cute. Actually looks similar to mine. Such a cutie. Exactly. So, and this is another moment. I mean, when animals portray their agency, so they actively say, "Hey, here I am. I want attention now." Then it's easier for us to acknowledge that these are subjective beings with their own perspectives, right? And if we constantly frame dairy cows and pigs and chickens as victims of the animal industry, then we may criticize their suffering, but we may do little in terms of fostering respect and acknowledgement of their perspectives. So I think it's very important to push to people's minds that, and I mean, now let me start differently. I think it's very effective to stage resistant characters in text or in films, because it can show people that animals have their own wills. But I wouldn't say that other animal characters are incapable of deindustrializing the imagination, and also that we don't need to have I think if our imagination was completely deindustrialized, which is a utopia, right? I mean, this can never happen. But in this case, but imagine this would be the case, then we would perceive animals trying to avoid the slaughterhouse or trying to escape, then we would, of course, acknowledge these as acts of resistance. And in the current state of the art, we with our industrialized minds, we would just simply say, okay, this is a disobedient cow or a disobedient dog. So in a way, you are right. Were our imagination deindustrialized, we would acknowledge that. And I think it goes the other way around, that if we actually acknowledge that, this might foster the process of deindustrializing our minds a little further.
That's an interesting thought, and one that we all will need to engage with some more. But for now, I wanted to ask you another question, which is not directly connected to your book as such, but which is largely about shifting trends in humanities, in the directions that various forms of scholarship have taken in the last few years. So we have seen in across disciplines, across fields, that there has been a slow but noticeable shift from a focus on difference and alterity to a focus on similarity and, let's say, relationality, which is also a process that has led to the emergence of a multi-species approach across disciplines. I'm trying to understand where this is coming from and what are the reasons that have led to this shift.
Mhm.
also in terms of understanding the relations between human and non-human animals. What has brought about this big shift?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. I think, as you said in my book, I touch upon that only peripherally in the very end. But I do think this is also it's also a trend that has really gained traction in the past few years. And I think it's first of all tied to the fact that we are undergoing, especially in the humanities and also in other areas of study, we are undergoing a shift towards acknowledging that humans are not categorically distinct from any other living beings or entities on Earth, but they're actually deeply entangled with it. And this is connected to Anthropocene research, of course, and connected to the fact that the Earth is getting ever closer towards crucial tipping points due to climate change and many other factors. Talk about planetary boundaries, and especially the question of species extinction, the accelerated extinction of species in the past few years, not past few years, since the 70s already. I mean, it's not that these thoughts are new, they've already been around since the 70s, but probably because there's more extreme weather events and there's more societies are really pushed slowly to realize what's actually happening. I mean, in Germany, at least, the debate has shifted again drastically. In our current elections, there's no talk of climate protection at all, which is very shocking. But there was a time where this was talked about more, and this obviously also touched academia and animal questions. And I guess that animal studies scholars have increasingly been dealing with these questions as well, and they've been dealing with questions around extinction of animal species and loss of biodiversity. And this is, of course, accelerated by the imbalance of relationships that humans nurture towards the planet and animal beings. So animal questions are very deeply related to planet-related questions. And I could imagine that a pure animal studies approach might overlook important questions that are related to human-plant relationships or human-fungi relationships. I mean, we have plant studies that is in critical plant theory that has gained popularity. It has also been evolved not only out of animal studies, but these fields are very closely related. And therefore, I think that multi-species studies is like a bit of a more all-encompassing field and an approach that allows to ask these questions in view of current dynamics of biodiversity loss, of climate change. And I think it's a very important shift, but I still think that it's important that we also focus our work. So I guess that like critical or cultural animal studies approaches can still be very effective if you really want to tackle an animal-specific question. I think that maybe a multi-species approach could also flatten out the distinct position that animals are in. And I wouldn't prioritize animals over plants or over volcanoes or river flows, but they are distinct. But they are distinctively vulnerable, especially if you talk about livestock animals. And they are not only distinctively vulnerable, but they are also they are also a bit closer to us, perhaps, than a river or a mountain is. Which does not mean, again, that we have to prioritize animals, but I do think that animal studies approaches have, they deserve also to maintain specific and to become even more specific and to develop further. That would be my opinion on that.
Krishna Noni, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation and for the book. I just wanted to ask a question because this is coming from a dilemma that we are usually in the context of India, where the human-animal separation, the binary is not very watertight. It is much more fluid. There are a lot of transactions and exchanges that happen between across the human-animal divide. Whether it is in the form of religion, animism, and gods with animal faces, and multiple linkages like that, which do not really place a lot of significance or relevance in a hard and fast binary or separation between humans and animals. But at the same time, the dilemma lies here that violence towards animals still persists. It is still very strong. It is still heavy, and it still persists despite the absence, or at least the superficial absence of a human-animal hard and fast binary. So I was just thinking, and I'm not sure if I understand or if I have managed to understand the category of the post-animal properly, but I just wanted to ask if the field or if the category of the post-animal might also be prone to such hierarchizations where some animals are kept in the status of animals only, whereas some animals are seen as post-animals where the human-animal distinction is considered irrelevant. While at the same time, some beings are, which obviously includes humans and non-humans, some beings are still deliberately kept at the status of animals. So is there, is the category of the post-animal also prone to this sort of a hierarchization, which again functions to allow the violence to continue as we see it right now?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure whether I understood the question correctly, but so let me clarify. You are wondering whether the post-animal category would run the risk of prioritizing certain animals because they are post-animals as opposed to other animals that are not post-animals. And in terms of, because as I explained in the start, I understand that a cow might be understood as a post-animal being because it has been bred over centuries and altered by human breeding practices. So therefore, it has been domesticated and farmed, and it's not an original animal, so to say. And then you are wondering whether this category might cause us to prioritize these beings over others. Is that what you imply?
No, not exactly. Let me rephrase the question. I'm just trying to understand how the category of the post-animal interacts with, or what changes does the category of the post-animal make in the discourse of animalization, especially in the racist genealogies.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that is an interesting question. I also touch upon that in chapter 3 because it actually very productively challenges the human-animal binary at its core. And I've come across some work by Black vegan studies scholars who are also engaging with the idea of that questioning the human-animal binary might be very productive in terms of questioning dehumanization and of unsettling white supremacist ideologies. And so if you're more interested in that, I could direct you to Sill and Afro's work. I think I also quoted in my book, I forgot the title of their work because they go much more into detail here. And I think the post-animal really speaks to that. Because it obviously is set on the level of fiction. I mean, I am not implying by post-animality that this is a concept that we should address, that we should apply to the real world necessarily, but it still suggests that categories such as animal or human are cultural constructs, and so they are socially constructed being categories, and the construction of these categories runs along similar lines like racialized categories. So what post-animal figures in science fiction do, as I mentioned earlier, they provide retraining platforms where you are invited to undergo processes of animalizing or of dehumanizing certain species. And for example, we have there's a sci-fi classic by called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Almost everyone knows it, and we have a cow character there that has been genetically modified, and the cow works at a restaurant, and the cow is herself offering her body parts to be consumed. So we have this post animal, and the cow actually tells the guests, "Hi, to tackle the problem of animal ethics, we've actually come up with an animal that wants to be eaten and invites you to. So which part would you like?" And And that's what these texts do. They actually demonstrate to readers there's not only an animalization or a post-animalization, but also a dehumanization. And so therefore, I think these figures can be productive for analysis in these along these lines, but my analysis didn't go that deeply into it. So if you're more interested, I think there's definitely work to be done. I hope it can be productive in this regard, but I myself haven't engaged with it more deeply.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
So I still have a lot of questions in mind, Lisa, but since we're running out of time, perhaps we'll take the question that's in the chat from Deepak. Deepak, would you like to read out your question or pose it directly, or should I read this out for you?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so the question is directed more towards Susan's comment on and what Lisa replied to that. So Susan pointed out that there is this allegorical interpretation which we see in most instances of literature, and Lisa then answered that there are three levels of violence: intersubjective, structural, and epistemological. Uh, Towards this epistemological bias or barrier that we see, I thought of Jan Martel's Life of Pi, both movie as well as the book. Towards the end, and the reader is mostly confused whether there were actually animals or were there animals or not. So the question that I want to pose is rather uh, not well articulated at this point is, if at all we can let go of this anthropocentrism or anthropocentric inference or interpretation of animal figures or non-human figures in literature.
Thank you. I guess we can't ever completely let go. That would be a very direct answer. As I mentioned earlier, in connection to the anthropocentric bias, I think neither the way we write nor the way we read or perceive a story can ever be non-anthropocentric. And I think this is a very important point to acknowledge, because we humans have to learn that no matter how good our science may be, whenever we try to understand something that is not human, it can always be faulty. We always have to be open to rectify or to change what we thought we knew, because we learn something new. And I guess that this is a very important lesson that animal texts may teach us. I engaged with this very much in my chapter 5, which is about Adam Roberts' bat, because this really engages a lot with the fallacy of over empathizing with animals, or of putting and of viewing or of taking for granted what we think we know about human animal differences. And the example of Life of Pi, I don't know the novel, I only know the film. So probably the novel is, I could imagine the novel is a bit more, goes a bit deeper, goes a bit more deeply into this. But I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing that we can only read anthropocentrically, because after all, we are humans and we are trying to make sense of the human world. And we can self-reflectively and self-critically embrace questions of otherness, and this addresses questions of otherness that can shed light on different cultures. I mean, we can never know for sure what the perception of a person of a different of a different social background is, right? I mean, we are much closer. I mean, you're sitting in India, and we can communicate very well, but still, I can never completely know what's going on in your head. So my reading of you, of all of you, is biased by my German. Is German carries a German bias, and my personal bias, of course. And the bias and the distance between our perception and animal perception is just much greater than the distance between you and I. But I think that still, but I think that this doesn't mean that it's not worth it to try and to figure out more and to get better at understanding other beings, beings that are other from us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This is unfortunately all that we have time for today. But I look forward to reading more of your book and possibly coming up with questions which I will email to you at some point of time. Thank you, everyone who made the time to be here. Thank you, Lisa, again for making the time, for joining us today, and for answering our questions so generously, so patiently. It has helped us all undoubtedly a lot in progressing the way we think about animals. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening or a great morning, depending on where you are, and see you next time for the next episode of Table Talk.
Thank you all so much for your questions, and also you, Anu, for organizing and for inviting me. It has been fun.
Yes, absolutely.